and I'm the director of the Environment and Natural Resource Program. I want to begin, okay, usually people can hear me. I want to begin by thanking the sponsors of this event, the Belfer Center, the Shorenstein Center for Media, Politics, and Public Policy, the Student Sustainability, Energy, and Environmental Policy Public Interest Group, and finally, the Center for Public Leadership. For 10 years, under the direction of Chris Russell, we have put together a series of events bringing journalists, scientists, and public officials to the Kennedy School to discuss climate. This has allowed us not only to get an insight into the thinking in terms of what the scientists and policy people think, but also what journalists think about these issues. Today, we have a special treat for you. We have Professor Michael Mann of Penn State, and we have Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist Tom Toles. Let me say a few words about Chris Russell, and then I will turn the podium over to her. I should know this by heart by now, but Chris is a senior fellow at the Environment and Natural Resource Program. She's been a veteran journalist who for 2 decades covered science, health, and environment. And she is contributing editor to the Columbia Journalism Review, past president of the Council for Advancement of Science Writing, and continues to serve on its executive board. And she has been basically the leader and stalwart here at the Kennedy School in putting together journalism, climate, and environment. And with this, let me turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Henry. Okay, welcome to everyone. First, I'm going to show you a colorful book that is the inspiration for having Michael Mann and Tom Toles here today. Their book, The Madhouse Effect, How Climate Change Denial is Threatening Our Planet, Destroying Our Politics, and Driving Us Crazy. So you can see the title, we shortened it a little bit, but the interesting thing is they wrote the book and it came out in late 2016. And a few things happened after late 2016. So they have updated, and they're going Tom has been doing a lot of cartoons over the last year. He does 6 days a week cartoons and a blog for the Washington Post. And so they are updating for us today the view a year plus into the Trump administration. And Michael has been really one of the leading, first of all, he's a leading climate scientist with outstanding scientific work on climate change, climate science, the well-known hockey stick. I'm not going to try to explain that, but you'll see an illustration of that. And he actually, from the beginning, has been an outstanding communicator. It's unusual among scientists to have a scientist who is willing to put his neck on the line, get outside of the science, go around the country, write books, and also have initially a lot of true persecution from parts of the climate denial movement, parts of government where he's been sued, in states and such. So he has endured a lot of, how do you put it? Anyway, persecution. And the good news is, there has been a wake-up call about climate change and climate action after the Obama administration initiated so many things in the last 2 years of that administration. And we have somewhere, well, he's not here at the moment, but we have here at the Kennedy School Obama's former science advisor, John Holdren, and he is also a strong supporter of the two of them. But after the Obama administration and the Trump administration came in, there were all sorts of dire predictions. And our speakers last year, also on Valentine's Day, talked about what might happen. Well, now we know more about what has happened, and as I say, there's been a wake-up call, and Michael has gone from his position of kind of a lonely crusader out there to being a center in Washington and around the country of scientists waking up and feeling, wow, we need to do something, we need to communicate better what we do, why this is important, why there isn't doubt about man-made, human-made, anthropogenic climate change, and what needs to be done about it. And so I did want to mention, he has a long resume, but he has just gotten 2 awards, in fact, one today, from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is meeting this weekend in Texas. And this is the 2018 Award for Public Engagement with Science. And he also recently got the 7th Annual Stephen Schneider Award for Outstanding Climate Science Communication. So it's really a recognition that he has done so much work in this area. Tom has also been involved and interested in a lot of issues, and being at the Washington Post, everything has the word politics attached, and also being in the first year of the Trump administration, he will be talking about that as well. He has been an editorial cartoonist, he has a strong point of view at the Washington Post since 2002. Earlier had been at 2 Buffalo papers. He has won countless prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize Award in 1990 for editorial cartooning, actually before he came to the Post. I think as soon as you win a Pulitzer Prize, then the Post or the New York Times is like, yeah, I think he should come here. So, but he has a strong passion about climate science, climate change, what we need to do, and they're going to talk through cartoons about their interesting novel collaboration from science to cartoons, satire to reality. So I'm going to turn it over to them, and I think you'll be interested to see the illustrations of the cartoons behind it.
Okay, well, thanks very much.
Check, check.
Here, take this.
Hello. Well, thanks very much for coming out for this event, and thanks so much to Chris and the others here for inviting us to do this. We're going to try to talk about a problem that has become very contentious in our public discourse, human-caused climate change, in a slightly different way, using satire and humor to maybe, find a new way to talk about a problem that continues to be vexing in terms of garnering the attention and action that we really need to see. So I think Tom and I will just sort of go back and forth and muse about the various cartoons and what parts of the story they tell. I thought I'd start off, well, you've seen the cover of the book, and then off to the side is a photo that Tom did that frankly I think makes him look a lot better than me, but I'm just... But you're probably wondering at this point, what is it that an editorial cartoonist and a climate scientist might have in common? Well, the thing we have in common is that we both care very much about this problem, and we want to use what modes of communication we have to try to communicate the reality of the problem, the threat that it represents, and to encourage action. We use different implements, as you see Tom there with his artist's pen, and me there with my hockey stick, which is, of course, in Boston. I grew up in Massachusetts. I was a Bruins fan growing up, and so I have an appreciation for the sport of hockey, but the hockey stick, of course, is this curve that my University of Massachusetts co-author Raymond Bradley and I and another co-author Malcolm Hughes from the University of Arizona published back in the late 1990s, and it demonstrates demonstrated that the warming we've seen over the last century really is unprecedented as far back as we can go. It was over 1,000 years at the time. And you don't need to understand the inner workings of the climate system, the physics of climate, the minutia of the underlying science to understand what that curve is telling us, that there's something unprecedented taking place today in our climate, and by implication, it probably has to do with us. And so it became, to mix metaphors, a lightning rod in the climate change debate, and I found myself at the center of that very contentious debate over human-caused climate change early on in my career. I like to think that that prepared me well for this ongoing battle that we are involved in trying to communicate the reality and threat of this problem in the face of a fairly concerted headwind by fossil fuel interests and front groups who are trying to cloud the public understanding of the science as a way to forestall action. So that's my interpretation. Tom?
Okay. I'd like to extend Michael's thank you to each and every one of you in the audience. I really appreciate your being here. I appreciate, both of us appreciate your interest in the subject matter. I'm going to assert, and you can argue, but you won't because you don't have a microphone yet. It's absolutely the most important subject, and that is being addressed so half-assedly. There's nothing more consequential over longer term that's going to affect more people that we're dealing with worse. Okay, I just want to point out one thing about the cover. This was done for the first edition. It'll probably be the same cover for the paperback. But in the subtitle, how climate change denial is threatening our, I'm pointing here, but back there, threatening our planet. Everybody understands that. The end of it is how it's driving us crazy. Anybody that's had anything to do with this subject knows how frustrating it has been from the beginning in terms of understanding, getting people to understand, getting people to act. Just maddening for sure. But the middle part is the part that's become almost most salient now, destroying our politics. That was a prediction or an ongoing statement. We are close now to having our politics destroyed, and I'm not saying that everything can be explained by what's happened in terms of climate change, but the one significant salient thing that has been at the heart of the climate debate has been misuse of facts, and this is the path that opponents have chosen to go down on this subject, and it is like a poison in the system that's spreading to every subject now. The whole debate as to what is a fact, is there such a thing as a fact, and we are now experiencing a cataclysm of politics in the current administration, of the destruction of the factual basis for politics, public policy, any kind of discussion about anything, what constitutes news, which I'm involved in every day. It's the problem at the core of climate change is now the problem at the core of pretty nearly every subject we face politically. Okay.
Other than that, we're very optimistic. So let's go on, and we'll sort of walk through the science and the impacts and the politics, and indeed some reasons for cautious optimism by sort of talking about our work.
All right. Now this is an odd one. This isn't actually an editorial cartoon, but the Washington Post came to me 2 weeks ago. I've already got enough work to do, but they said, oh, the Olympics are coming up, so could you do a series of drawings, let's say 8 drawings. You've got plenty of time to do 8 additional drawings on what the Winter Olympics would look like without winter. All right, and I thought, that sounds like more work. But on the other hand, it's one more opportunity to address the subject from yet a different subject. And it was pretty straightforward. I didn't bring all 8. I'm not going to subject. I just brought 2. But Christine said, oh, the Olympics. Yeah, you got to put some of those, because everybody's going to think about the Olympics. So obviously there's the visual of no ice. But then I started playing with some of the names, too. Instead of speed skating, this one is speed scraping, which kind of cute, Do you want to say anything or should I? Okay. The next one is the one I thought was the funniest one, the luge. And I don't have anything to say about that. I was wondering if they were going to say, this is a little, no, we don't like this. It's not what we were, but they didn't even ask about this, so I was happy with that. All right, that's it.
Before we go on, let me ask people who are tweeting about this event, please use the hashtag Madhouse Effect if you're tweeting about it, and we'll make sure to retweet and do all those great things later on. I guess we will go on.
Okay, Christine, our host and moderator, has also said, don't just run the old ones, get some of the Trump ones up. And this was one of the early ones I did. This was December after he was elected, and they were talking about how he was going to repeal all the legislation, but I changed that around to first 100 days we'll rewrite all the laws of physics, which is essentially what the subject is about. That's Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan down there with him.
Yeah, as a physics major, as an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, I'm very offended by their violation of the law of physics, and unfortunately it gets at this issue of alternative facts. Today, objective truth doesn't seem to mean as much in our public discourse as it used to mean, and there are people who are willing to literally disbelieve the consensus view of the world's scientific community based on the ideological inconvenience of what that science indicates. And we see that today in our Congress. I have often commented that we no longer have a science committee in the U.S. House of Representatives. We have an anti-science committee. We have a chair of that committee who promotes anti-science when it comes to issues like climate change. And it's probably just a coincidence that he is one of the largest recipients of fossil fuel money in the U.S. House of Representatives.
Okay, here's another early Trump cartoon. This is an example of the polemics that the Republicans have become masters of. In any normal decision-making process, you would analyze the situation as saying, okay, fossil fuels are a problem. What's the worst part of the problem? Coal is the worst part of the problem. We'll start shifting away from coal. He and the Republican Party have turned this completely around into some kind of crazed war on coal. Now, there was never a war on anybody. It was a policy shift based on known facts, known science. So he turned it around into a war on coal. I turned it around again on him. For him, it's not a war on coal, it's a war on the planet. I drew an old steam tractor with a mounted cannon on it to sort of represent how archaic the whole coal era is in American history and technology. So that was what was going on here.
Yeah, if there's a war on coal, it's being fought by the free market, because the fact is that coal can no longer compete with natural gas for one, but increasingly renewable energy. And so when people say there's a war on coal, and they come at this from a conservative sort of market economy standpoint, in fact, it is the market economy which is making coal extinct. As renewable energy becomes more efficient, it becomes cheaper. That's the natural evolution that our economy is taking. The rest of the world recognizes this, and they're moving on, and the real danger here in the United States is that we fall behind the rest of the world, because as they're moving ahead with new energy technology, renewable energy technology, and that's what's going to lead the 21st century economy, we're going in the wrong direction right now.
Okay, this is your business. No, this isn't part of your, or is this? Was this your first slide?
You take a stab and
Well, that's why. All right, I'll just back up a step in what can a cartoonist bring to this issue other than attention and passion. It's visuals. I mean, especially now, when I first started cartooning on this issue, a lot of the physical manifestations hadn't really started showing up yet, but now there's droughts, there's flooding, there's tornadoes, there's hurricanes, there's rainstorms of historic proportions. So now there are a bit more visuals to work with. And here again, blazing sun, baked soil, desert conditions, some skeletons. This is a prediction which seemed slightly more optimistic when I drew it than it necessarily does right now, that eventually the subject is going to sink the Republican Party because they've lashed their identity, their politics, their agenda to bad facts, bad science, and bad outcomes, and this is going to get them eventually. And I just, this is something that visuals can sometimes get across quicker, more compellingly than a lot of paragraphs.
Yeah, and in this cartoon, there are actually reasons for both optimism and pessimism. The obvious reason for pessimism, first of all, that Donald Trump has threatened to leave the Paris Accord and make the United States the only country now in the world that wouldn't be part of the Paris Accord. The good news is that if every other country makes good on their commitments and states and municipalities just continue what they're doing here in the United States, we will make good on our Paris commitments even without the formal approval of Donald Trump, and we will get on the path. We won't solve the problem, but we'll start to get on the path that we need to be on if we're going to limit warming below dangerous levels. The pessimism here is that, well, warming in some sense has already reached dangerous levels, whether it's superstorms that literally have destroyed Puerto Rico and have done great damage. Cities like Houston, unprecedented flooding, superstorms, unprecedented wildfires. The worst wildfire in California history happened in the winter this year. That's not supposed to happen. The fire season is getting longer. It actually did damage to Rupert Murdoch's estate out in Southern California. Murdoch, of course, being one of the greatest funders of climate change denialism today. So maybe even he's starting to get a wake-up message here. But the impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. We're seeing them play out now in real time.
I don't know. I will put all these in here anyway. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this. Again, it's a visual. It's emissions of the Trump era. It's not just climate gases. They're also fumes. They're cutting back on normal particulate kind of pollution rules, pending spills. But I guess the one additional thing that refers to something I was talking about before is outright lying has become a standard emission of the administration, and replacing alternative fuels with alternative facts is what I have down at the bottom. So that's all that's about.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to the pollution of our environment, the Trump administration is engaged in the pollution of our public discourse, and that's every bit as much a reason for worry. One of my favorites. So, one of my pet peeves as a scientist is that the forces of anti-science and denial too often attempt to sort of wear the mantle of Galileo. Galileo, too, was railing against the hegemony of the church, and so climate change deniers today like to sort of present themselves as modern-day Galileos, railing against the scientific establishment. But as this cartoon by Tom nicely illustrates, for every real Galileo, there are 1,000 pretenders who are just cranks dressed up like Galileo, and that's what we encounter, and they're given a megaphone now. In today's world, they have a megaphone in the form of the conservative media and the White House when it comes to the promotion of misinformation and disinformation and anti-science.
And just a related thought on this, the anti-climate people have become specialists in whatever they're guilty of. They turn that around into a charge on climate science supporters. And in the blog I write every day, there's a guy a troll I've had for 10 years. He's unshakable, but he's a good example, and it relates to this cartoon. He said what he says is, belief in climate science is just a leftist religion. And, you know, it's an infuriating, and he knows the difference. He does this just to infuriate. But, I mean, it's the idea that the science now is the religion, just the way Galileo was railing against religion as religion. Infuriating, maddening. I think someone should write a book with that as the theme. Anyway.
Yeah, and some of these talking points, they seem very clever when we discuss them, and that's because they're not accidental. They've been created in lobbying firms in Washington, D.C., they've been poll tested, they've been focus grouped, and they're laid out there. And there is essentially this rabble online and elsewhere that are more than happy to continue to parrot these denialist talking points. And the principle here, of course, being that a lie repeated often enough becomes accepted as truth. And, you know, it was Mark Twain who once said, a lie can make it halfway around the world in the time that the boots is just getting its the truth is just getting its boots on. And you know how prescient it was for him to say that in the 19th century, something that is so obviously true now today. So one of the pet peeves of mine as a scientist, a climate scientist communicator, is this fallacy that because we can't literally attribute individual weather events to climate change, that somehow invalidates the linkage between climate change and unprecedented weather events of the sort that we've seen over the last year, unprecedented superstorms and wildfires and floods that are certainly becoming more pronounced and more frequent because of climate change. And this is really similar in many ways to the linkage between smoking cigarettes and lung cancer. You can't prove that any one person, any one smoker who died of lung cancer absolutely died from smoking cigarettes, but it turns out that that increased the likelihood of them dying from lung cancer by a factor of 100. And that's a large enough statistical impact for us essentially to draw causal inference that smoking causes lung cancer and other ailments. And in the same sense, climate change leads to more extreme weather events of the sort that we've been talking about. And to deny otherwise, or to try to hinge your argument on this loophole that you can't prove that that one event was caused by climate change is indeed, as Tom, and you all know with Tom's cartoons, you have to read the fine print at the bottom corner of the cartoon, because often that's the pearl of, that's the nugget of wisdom that is critical for the context. In this case, that's a loophole that you could lose a planet through.
And I just, and again, in turning arguments backwards, they will always say, oh, you can't blame this storm, you're politicizing this storm, you're politicizing people's suffering. But on the other hand, when you have a cold day, you have a senator stand up in Washington with a snowball in his hand and say, see, this proves that climate change is a myth. His snowball in winter. Okay.
I think that might be coming up. We'll see.
We got that in here. Okay.
I can't really remember. Okay, and so there is this sort of hierarchy in the denial of climate change. We call it the stages of denial. The most basic of those stages being, you know, the assertion that it's not happening, that climate change isn't happening. How many people in this room have heard the claim that there is a pause in global warming? There was a hiatus in warming. Well, let's see, 2014 was the warmest year globally on record until 2015, which was the warmest year on record, until 2016, which was the warmest year on record, 3 consecutive record-breaking years, and you can calculate the likelihood of that happening by chance alone, and it's extremely low. We know that that wouldn't have happened in the absence of climate change. The good news is that 2017 was not the warmest year on record. It was only the second warmest year. So there's no pause in warming. The only pause is the pause in taking the actions necessary to do something about it. And then, my favorite, okay, well, all right, maybe it's warming, but hey, it's natural. It's natural. Stovetop temperatures change all the time after all.
Well, everybody knows the legend. I'm not sure there's any scientific basis for it, that if you throw frogs into a boiling pot of water, they jump out immediately. If you warm the water slowly, they will just swim around until they're cooked. That's apocryphal. It doesn't matter. As Ronald Reagan says, it may not be true, but it made the point. Now I'm quoting Ronald Reagan. This is not a good sign. But again, aside from the fact that I didn't know how to really draw the flames around a glass bowl, so I took the easy way out. They look more like teeth, I think, but you get the idea.
Yeah, and of course, we know that it's not natural. In fact, if it were just natural factors that were at work, the climate would actually have cooled over the last half century because of an increase in explosive volcanism, a small downturn in solar output, the brightness of the sun. So if natural factors were primarily driving the system, it should have actually cooled. And because of that, when we talk about the question, how much of the warming are we responsible for? Because one of the popular refrains among sort of quasi-denialist politicians today is that, well, maybe we're responsible for some of the warming. Well, no, in fact, we're responsible for more than 100% of the warming, because the climate would have actually cooled, most likely, in the absence of increasing greenhouse gas concentrations. So then the next stage, all right, well, maybe it's not natural, but hey, it's self-correcting.
Right. Yeah. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So okay, I drew the picture, and then they invite me here to give you the 1,000 words. In some ways, it seems a little redundant. I'll just let you read that and figure it out for yourself.
The point being, it's not self-correcting in any meaningful sense. We can certainly warm the planet back to the levels that existed during the early Cretaceous period, when there was no ice on the face of the planet and sea levels were hundreds of feet higher. And yes, nature can adapt to changes like that take place over 100 million years. Make those same changes over 100 years, and nature cannot adapt, nor can we. Another popular refrain is, well, who's to say what the best climate is? In fact, I believe we saw this argument from Scott Pruitt, our EPA administrator, just last week. Who's to say what the ideal climate is? We know what the ideal climate is. It's the climate that our civilization is very heavily adapted to, and that we rely upon to maintain the food and water and land resources for 7 billion and growing people.
And then just a related thought. I read, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, an argument that you don't need to worry about extinctions because extinctions, like everything else, happen all the time. What he cleverly left out is extinctions can happen overnight, and how fast you get new species, well, don't wait around for them. That's the answer to that.
Okay, then, fine, okay, next, well, all right, maybe it's not self-correcting, but it's a good thing. And of course, we would laugh at that if it were not the fact that this last week, our EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, as was widely reported, made exactly that argument. He's moved on. It's good to see that Scott Pruitt has moved on from one stage of denial to the next. He's now arrived at the completely unsupportable position. Well, okay, but it's a good thing, right? Melting ice sheets lift all boats. And then finally,
those of you art history students might have seen Salvador Dali's Persistence of Memory. I don't know. If you do a cartoon every day, eventually you get around to every single image that there is in the entire universe. This is, I changed the clocks into sundials because it's about sunshine, and everything's pretty much dead, and that's the persistence of procrastination.
We've got Edvard Munch for the cover. We've got Salvador Dali here. Is there any Van Gogh in any of your?
Yes, you mentioned it. I've got them all. I've done them all.
All right, so, I find this one ironic. It's like, we spent all this time debating the causes, and unfortunately, now it's too late to do anything about it. And the good news is it's not. We know that we're starting to see the changes that are necessary in our behavior to avert dangerous warming, but we've still got much more work to do. The Paris Accord gets us about halfway to the reductions necessary to avert a dangerous 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 degree Fahrenheit warming of the planet, but it doesn't get us all the way. So we need to build on that progress at the next major conference, not move backward in the wrong direction as our current president and congressional enablers are trying to do. Paralysis.
Well, this is a phenomenon that anybody that's been engaged in any kind of public action has probably run into, is if you see a project coming and it looks like a bad project and you start to ask questions or complain, they always will say, don't worry yet, it's way too soon. These drawings that we've given you don't represent the final project. Wait until we're farther along before you make your complaints. Then all of a sudden, the drawings are finished and out, and you come and say, okay, now I actually do have some very specific complaints. And they say, wow, it's too late now. You should have said something earlier, that all the contracts have been let, nothing can be done. The process, the bulldozers are running across the ground already, too bad. It's the same thing in anti-climate action strategy. They were always saying, we don't know, let's not do anything too soon, why waste money, when we could actually have tackled the problem early on, had big results at low cost. We wasted all that time. So until the science was firm, which it is, it pretty much always was, but now it's irrefutably firm, and now it's like, okay, now can we get started? No, it's too late. It's degrees. It's cost too much, way too much now. Let's just deal with it. Let's build some dikes and push it off onto the next generation. This is the same thing. It's never the right time to do anything, and it's in fact, it's always the right time. It would have been the right time then. It's the right time now, and it will be the right time tomorrow too.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think this, cartoon also makes the point. I'll give you an example. There are some public figures in the climate change debate who have claimed that no matter what we do, we are now committed to uncontrollable, catastrophic warming of the planet that will lead to an extinction of all life on Earth within 10 years. And I'm not making that up. If you Google, you'll find an individual with seemingly credible credentials who has made precisely that argument. And that is every bit, in my view, as damaging and destructive as outright denial of climate change, because it leads you down the same path of inaction. If there really is no agency to our actions, then why do anything about the problem? And I imagine that argument is very appealing to fossil fuel interests who don't want to see us act on this problem. They don't care what the reason is, and this is something we were talking about earlier today. The interesting thing about those sort of different stages of denial and different individuals making different arguments, the only commonality to all the arguments being put forward against action is that they lead us to inaction. The reasons are never consistent, and you see some scientists and public officials who move from one stage to the next. But the only consistency is their argument that we don't need to do anything about our profligate burning of fossil fuels. Geoengineering.
Go ahead.
This is one of my favorites. I think actually Marty Feldman, did he pass away? I think he passed away. So this is an ode to, of course, Marty Feldman as Igor. And there are schemes And here at Harvard, as many of you folks know, there has been a pretty active discussion about the science of geoengineering. And the argument is that we won't, we won't engage in the actions necessary to lower our emissions enough to avoid catastrophic warming of the planet. So we need to do something else. We need to engage in some other intervention with the climate system to try to offset the warming effect of increasing greenhouse gas concentrations. And not all of there are some schemes out there that potentially could be safe and could make a dent in the problem, could help us get to where we need to go. But in many of these cases, if we were to engage in the actions that have been promoted, we could end up being even worse off than we were before because of the unintended consequences, because the law of unintended consequences. When you're tampering at the global scale with a system you don't understand, and it turns out to be the only system that we know in the universe that can sustain life, then the precautionary principle reigns supreme, that we probably shouldn't be taking those actions. And yet, there is an active discussion of geoengineering. In some cases, it's become a crutch. For example, Rex Tillerson, our Secretary of State, former CEO of ExxonMobil, is a big fan of techno fixes of the climate that don't involve, ironically, stopping the burning of fossil fuels. Well, it's a pretty convenient position for the former CEO of the world's largest fossil fuel company. The path forward, well, we know what the path forward is. Paris helps us get on that path. It doesn't solve the problem, as we already talked about. I don't know. I want to get on to the Q&A as quickly as we can. So.
You've got a little more time.
All right. 10 more minutes. So I won't say a whole lot other than, the rest of the world is getting on that right path. We literally, if Donald Trump is to make good on his threat to pull out of Paris, we would be the only car continuing straight down that highway. Every other car would be getting on the right path, and we get left behind.
Yeah, no, he explains them better than I do.
This is a favorite.
All right. The book was going to press. The election hadn't happened. We didn't have much of anything in the way of Trump cartoons because it was the middle of the campaign.
We didn't have a Trump cartoon.
Didn't have
we didn't
any
have a
Trump.
single one in the book.
Okay, so this was a last-minute addition. Got to have something about Trump. We don't know what we presume he won't get elected, but there he is. It's possible he will. What will apply to Trump in any case? Well, it's a riff on his wall. He built a wall. Not Mexico paying for it. You'll pay for it. And now here we are. He's there denying everything still, and we are getting ready to pay the price.
Yes, in fact, we learned today that this is a personal favorite of the former presidential science advisor. Back when we had a presidential science advisor, that person seemed to appreciate this cartoon. Well, there it is.
Okay. There were three crises when I do this cartoon. The healthcare crisis. Well, we've got temporarily halfway down that road with Obamacare. We got Obamacare. We got the Wall Street crisis. We solved that by, instead of helping the people who were losing their houses, we helped the people that helped them lose their houses. But in any case, the economic crisis was addressed. But if you look a little farther into the picture, both of those things reside in a larger context. The larger context, of course, is the planet, and in this instance, 2 out of 3, while they may look pretty big on the surface, turn out to be less important.
Yeah, and in my presentations, I tend to spin this cartoon in a way that I think is different from, what Tom has intended, which is simply to make the point that, what is this all about? Why is it important to get this right? it literally is about the planet, what sort of planet do we want to leave behind for our children and grandchildren? That's the question that we have to answer. And hopefully we will make the right decision and they won't look back decades from now and ask, why our generation had the potential to save the planet and we didn't do it. I don't want that to be our future, and this is a reminder that that's one possible future, but it's not the future that I like to think we will have.
We would like to answer some questions, and hopefully we'll get some interesting and even challenging questions. Difficult questions are most welcome. Yes.
Oh, wait, hold on one sec.
Jump the gun.
Hey, I mean, I did say you guys could take over, but I wanted, I'm Chris Russell, and I teach a class on controversies in climate, energy, and the media. I have a number of students who are in the room, and there are a lot of other Kennedy School students. And so I want to encourage the students to ask questions first. We've got a standing mic back there, and we have a roving mic if you can't make it over there. So, oh, there's another. What? Okay, we'll put the other one over there. I did want to just add before we started the questions, again, Harvard rules, ask a question, please. We really don't have time to have big statements, which I'm sure everybody here is thinking about these issues, but we'd like to have Tom and Michael talking. And I can't resist one editorial comment, because the last one up here, The Planet, I can't quite read, but I think that's 2010. And this was actually, because I've used this cartoon a lot, this was showing that in the 2 terms of the Obama administration, the climate got put behind the healthcare, and then, of course, there was the big depression and Wall Street. So it took quite a long time, actually, for it to get on the Obama administration's radar screen up front, even though the science advisor, John Holdren, and the group were working very hard on this and on international agreements. So this is not a new problem, that it hasn't been at the forefront and at the end of the Obama administration, I think. So you guys might want to comment on that. I also just wanted to say that it's really extraordinary. These two work so hard. I've now decided that Tom Toles is the hardest working person, because he has volunteered to not only do 6 cartoons a week on deadline, but then he's now writing this blog, which has a different cartoon, and that's very unusual for a cartoonist. So I would encourage everybody to look up Tom Toles, Washington Post, and you can look through the backlog and look at his blog. He comments on all of them. Similarly, Michael Mann is all over the social media world. So he is commenting on everything, traveling around. So he also has his own is it michaelemann.net? Or something.
Michaelmann.net.
Yeah.
Michaelmann.net.
And he has a lot of information on that website. So wanted to emphasize those 2 things, and also, again, following both of them at Tom Toles Tunes and at Michael E. Mann. So I was hoping like the students would be just rushing up there by now. Students, rush.
Extra credit?
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say either that or I have some targets here.
Sure, I guess I'm a student in the class and at HPS, and I had a question about how you think about balancing the rhetoric of like going to war, basically, and building bridges. So like extending a hand, trying to be getting on the same side of the table versus like, you know, being on our side or something and fighting the bad guys.
Well, it's a fair question. It's a good question, and you know, I would say that is not a war that we chose to be in, but we're in a war. The journal Nature, which is the most revered scientific journal. Well, Science is up there too. I think the oldest journal has weighed in that climate scientists have to recognize that they're in a street fight. So we're in a fight. We didn't choose to be there, but that's where we are, and we have to choose what we're going to do. As I often like to point out, we can't engage in the tactics that our critics engage in. We have to be true to our scientific principles. We have to respect the truth, scientific truth. We have to admit uncertainties where they are. We have to be clear what the caveats are. And so, in a sense, it's an asymmetric war. We're sort of fighting with one arm tied behind our back because we have to respect all of these principles. We have to be true to our principles as scientists. The other side has no such interest. They're more than happy to offer up alternative facts and untruths and engage in ad hominem attacks aimed at discrediting scientists rather than addressing the actual scientific evidence. So I guess my point ultimately is we didn't choose to be in a war, but we have to recognize that we're in one. And we can't use the underhanded tactics of our critics. We have to respect the rules of engagement that are intrinsic to fact-oriented discourse, to evidence-based, which apparently the NIH is no longer allowed to use evidence-based because that's a political term in today's world. We can't allow that. We have to fight for the notion that facts matter, that evidence matters. And if you simply saying that our discourse should be evidence-based now is seen as engaging in politics. You're seen as a combatant by the other side simply by saying that facts matter. And, that isn't a choice that we made. We have to be even more effective than the other side because we can't engage in the underhanded tactics that they do, but we have this one amazing weapon on our side, and it's called truth.
Yeah, I'll just echo, it was a great answer. I can't improve on it. I tend not to think of it in terms of war. I just think the word crisis suffices, severe crisis. It's a crisis for the planet. As I said earlier, the tactics now against pro-climate action have sacrificed truth. And with truth goes science. And somebody at a lunch we had earlier, the question came up, well, should scientists engage in politics? And when the question is put that way, it's a hard question to answer. It's because it's the wrong question. What scientists, obviously, politics is not part of science, but prior to now, there was a presupposition that the ground on which science rested was safe, unassailable ground. Scientists cannot conduct science in a social, cultural, political environment where their actions, their work, their findings are subject to deliberate propagandistic misuse. Scientists, to do the very science that they want to do, need to help maintain the fundamental ground on which science has to operate, which is the respect for truth. And we are in a time now where the anti-climate forces are so desperate and so ruthless and it's not just the anti-climate people, but they're a part of a constellation. When truth comes to be an obstacle, truth will go. And this is what we are living through right now. I don't know how, I mean, we're living in a pretty special environment here with regard to truth and information and study and facts. But I can tell you, down there in Washington, it is a pitched battle as to whether respect for actual facts is going to be a cultural norm going forward. This is what we are dealing with every day down there. That is a political crisis. It's a scientific crisis. This problem on the climate of the Earth, as bad as it is metastasizing into everything. And in that sense, I did use the word battle. I prefer the word crisis, but it's definitely a fight that we have got to get on the right side of. And it's, Olympics, I mentioned Olympics earlier. This is a race now. You've got the facts on one side. You've got a plausible program that can actually save the climate. You've got technology going faster than some of the optimists even hoped it would go, in terms of solar and wind and other non-climate polluting energy sources, batteries. On the other side, you've got forces of delay, forces of dishonesty, forces of corruption, and you are living through a touch and go battle as to which fork in the road. We are kind of like Yogi Berra said, when you come to the fork in the road, take it. Well, we're taking it in the forehead right now. We have got to get this right, and it's happening as we're sitting here speaking or listening. It's happening right now, and this next year is critical. I'm not going to politicize it, except I am. The election is critical to make much of an impact on the right side of this ballot box as we're putting down to what can be still an effective tool to use. This election is so crucial. And I'm going to stop now talking.
Continuing with the students, can you just briefly identify yourselves too?
My name is Vishnu. I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School. I'm also taking Professor Russell's class. We had an entire day dedicated to discuss your book yesterday. So happy to see you guys in person. And thank you so much for coming. So something we discussed yesterday was how climate denialists are very successful in communicating. While their ideology might be, or their idea of denying climate change might be ideology-based, saying non-government intervention or economic interest, but they never point that out in their arguments. And most of the time where scientists fail to do is also we go with hard-hitting facts and evidence, but common man will never get it. We were discussing in the class that the battle of climate change has moved away from science to social sciences now, and how we can reach there. One of the things which I noticed in all of your cartoons is that it's hard-hitting, it's the truth, and it's very simple. So my question is very simple. How do you ideate?
How do I what?
How do you guys ideate? How do you bring up with these themes, and how do you connect all these very complex ideas
That's the question I can't answer because I don't know how it happens. My best guess is my brain has effective wiring, and it associates more randomly than other brains. And that's where good cartooning comes from. The other side of it is I work very, very hard as a non-scientist to get information right, to get my understanding right. When you get that right, then you're in a position to simplify, and I pick by images, by different aspects of the...
I can just reframe the question a little bit. If you have to take a class to teach scientists how to communicate, how will you do it?
I guess he's saying we would team teach that class. Actually, I think that would be a really fun class to team teach. Maybe we'll get you up to Penn State one of these. The premise of your question is a correct one, which is that science doesn't select for the best communicators, and the tools of science are not ideally suited to communication. A good friend of mine, Susan Joy Hassel, who's has been sort of working for decades to help the climate science community become more effective communicators, sort of describes it in terms of the inverted pyramid. Scientists like to lead with their uncertainty. They like to talk about the nuances, and then eventually, if you press them, eventually they'll get down to, okay, well, what is it we actually know? And if you take that approach to sort of public communication, you've lost your audience, remember, because most of them don't read past the headline, and certainly past the first paragraph. So you lead with what you know. And that goes against every instinct of being a scientist. So you do need to train scientists to be more effective communicators. I do not think that all scientists should be forced to go through that training. I think that would backfire. I think there are scientists, and we know many of them, who absolutely should not be involved in communicating to the public. They are best served, their skill set is best plays to doing science, being in the laboratory, and it would be alienating to tell scientists that they had to take a whole nother set of courses. And what we do need to do is to provide the resources for those scientists who have the interest and the inclination in communicating, to make sure that there are resources there to help them and to make sure that they get support. The good news is that I think that's happening. I think your generation you grew up in a world where engagement is part of your upbringing, where you use social media to communicate. You have a direct on-ramp to communicating with the world, and you've grown up, and younger folks have grown up, millennials have grown up in that environment, and I think it's a much more natural, it lends much more naturally to being a communicator.
I'll just add one thing. I mean, you want scientists to spend most of the time doing their work, but something they can do rather than communicating to the public is communicate to large media organizations. For example, if Michael sees something in the Washington Post where the reporting is just badly misleading, it would be useful for him to call the reporter, run through the problems, and often that will lead to a subsequent story or better understanding in the next story. And there you don't have to be quite so polemical. You can just say, this sentence is misleading, very misleading, for the following reasons. This fact is knowably false and has been falsified and experimental, and here are the experiments. Good reporters are very sensitive to getting facts right and understanding right. So that's a shortcut that scientists could take without compromising their public persona or their private work. Anyway, that's my only other thought.
Let's go over here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you both so much for coming. I'm Amy. I'm a student at the college, also taking Professor Russell's class, studying environmental science. And I guess I had a more personal question. So I guess this is also something I've been dealing with. So how do you sort of manage like the frustration or anger that comes with, like talking about climate change or like environmental issues on a daily basis, and also like getting that sort of like resistance, or like, how do you like emotionally manage that side of things?
I'll go first. For me, I don't entirely. One of the benefits of the job I have is I get to express exactly what I think and how I think it. A certain amount of anger is a fuel for an effective cartoon, because I mean, there's what's going on, what you see, the message, the joke, whatever. But over time, you get, and sometimes immediately, you can get the sense this person cares about this issue a lot. This is really a sharp, pointed message. Paramount is, what are you trying to say? That's first. Get that right. Get the point of view right. And then second is how to make that effective. And humor is one of those ways, anger is one of those ways. If channeled properly, it's a tool. Blind, flailing anger is self-defeating, both emotionally and tactically, but focused, targeted, refined anger and frustration at people who genuinely deserve to be targeted, that's an effective part of my job.
Yeah, I would basically echo what Tom just said. It's all about channeling that anger in a productive way. The public doesn't like angry scientists, but scientists who are impassioned, scientists who are engaged and emphatic, there are strong emotions that you can express, and ultimately you need to be yourself. I think to be an effective communicator, you need to be authentic. And sometimes people want to see that you're maybe a little ticked off, that, you've got, bad faith actors who are looking to mislead the public. We should all be a bit upset by that. And I don't think it's wrong to at least betray the fact that you're upset that these efforts, exist, but you don't want to come across as angry. And you need to resist that temptation to show that anger. You have to funnel it in a way that's productive. And I think that's true whether you're a scientist or a cartoonist or anybody else. I do think that there's something liberating about satire. It allows you to sort of stick the needle in a little bit in a way. And frankly, I think that much of our hardest hitting commentary, social commentary today, comes in the form of humor and satire. It isn't a coincidence that it's, Bill Maher and Colbert and Samantha Bee and, Jon Stewart. And of course, this is where we see our hardest hitting, commentary today. It's from our humorists and our satirists, because you have this license to go a little bit beyond what the straight up news reporter can do, I think.
And one more from here.
Hello, I'm another student. My name is Griselda Lopez. I'm from El Salvador. And I recently did a research for Professor Russell's class. It was about the media coverage of the flooding in Colombia last year. And what I noticed is that the fact that President Santos was very strong on the climate change effect on flooding, it shaped all the coverage of the media regarding what happened in this weather event. But on the contrary, Mr.
You want to
Santos,
trade, maybe? We'll trade? Just a thought.
but Mr. Santos had a lot of critics for that, not only for the science community, but for even NGOs saying that he was using climate change to divert responsibility. So I was thinking, what do you think that global leaders that are on your side can do to be more creative and to convince other people that climate change is real? Thank you.
Well, I think one approach would be to watch what our president is doing and do the opposite. One of my favorite Seinfeld episodes is when George realizes that if every instinct in his life has been wrong, then maybe the opposite is right. So we certainly have a roadmap for what not to do, to alienating our international partners, pulling out of international agreements, picking fights with our allies. In the previous administration, we have a roadmap for how to go about it, and we're very fortunate, that John Holdren, who's here at Harvard, was the presidential science advisor. I know John well, a brilliant scientist who understands politics and policy, and it was sort of a good perfect storm. We had people like John Holdren and Stephen Chu and Jane Lubchenco, and a president and a Barack Obama who got it, who understood understood the science well. If you talk to anybody, any scientists who have met with him, he gets it, he understands the science. He appointed people who were in a position to do something about it, and we were moving forward, maybe not as rapidly as we might like, and it gets back to sort of one of the things we talked about early on. Yeah, maybe we didn't see as much progress as we would have liked to see, but understand, you know, we had a president who was under constant attack, had a limited amount of political capital, expended much of it fighting for health care in the first term, and in the second term expended what capital he had left to do something on climate change, to do as much as he felt he could get away with faced with a Republican Congress.
I don't know. I mean, what turns out to be good political tactics is a certain degree a guessing game. I would say that a leader ought to do this, is first acknowledge the science straight up. Don't argue with it. Just say this is the way it is. Define the necessary stages that we're going to have to go through, cutting down on fossil fuels, building up the replacement, and do that simply, quickly, and then focus a national/international cause, an inspiring cause to build a new economy, and focus on all the benefits that this transition will yield. Who will the winners be? How everybody's going to win to a certain degree. And if somebody says, well, why should we follow your vision? The answer is back to the first point, because we have to do it. So let's do it right. Let's do it optimistically. Let's do it and make it into a cause. That's what's been missing, is the carrot out in front of how society can organize around an important, desirable, necessary thing, and then start emphasizing how exciting, rewarding, and great and gratifying that national, international cause would be. That's what I would say.
Do you want to drop the mic?
Hi, my name is Andrew. I'm a second-year student at the Fletcher School at Tufts, also in Professor Russell's class. So my question is kind of big, so apologies in advance. But we talk a lot about the fossil fuel lobby and about special interest groups as fueling this denialist craze. But my question for you is, how much does our failure to instill science literacy in learners play into what's going on right now? And if it's significant, what exactly should we, how should we approach that problem?
I can offer some thoughts, and Tom, I'm sure, has some as well. A book that I would suggest that anybody who cares about science and policy, actually any living human being, should read is Carl Sagan's Demon-Haunted World. And there is a chilling passage in the Demon-Haunted World, and I won't be able to recite it, where he describes essentially his worst fear of a society where the gulf between public understanding and technology has grown so large that people can, there's this chasm between those who are making policy and the people who are governed by those policies, and superstition and anti-science reign supreme in that environment. He basically forecasts decades ago what we're seeing today, and that's why it's so chilling. And so scientific illiteracy is essentially the food that anti-science, for the forces of anti-science, feed on, and anti-science efforts can be successful in an environment where people don't know how to determine the truth. They don't have the tools. If you go out on the internet and you do a search on a term like climate change or global warming, you'll find a lot of misinformation and disinformation. It's very difficult for the average person on the street to navigate the information highway, superhighway. And so we need to teach, in my view, one of the critical tools, and I'm sure that that's true here. One of the things that I tried to drive home in my first-year seminar course on climate change for our first-year students, undergraduates at Penn State, is how to critically appraise sources. You know, where is that information coming from? And sometimes it involves digging several levels down. All right, well, this website, who's running this website, and who's this organization, and who belongs to it, and who's funding them? If you can teach the tools of critical assessment of sources, then you can help people navigate these treacherous waters. So I think scientific illiteracy is part of the problem, but today we face something even more threatening, which is reality literacy, which is assessing what's real and what's fake. And that underlies all the challenges that we face. As Tom alluded to, the attacks that we saw by fossil fuel interests and the front groups that they fund and conservative funders like the Koch brothers on climate science years ago were sort of a template. It was a test run, as far as I'm concerned, for what we're seeing now. And to draw out the analogy that Tom used, what was this localized cancer in our public discourse over climate change has now metastasized to this cancer in our entire body politic. And it comes down to discerning reality from falsehood. And it's becoming increasingly difficult for the person on the street to do that.
Okay, I was actually trying to think of what I would say, and being a cartoonist, I boiled it down even farther. I think the single most important thing to communicate in education, and it's a lesson that took me a while to pick up. It's not explicit, it's implicit in everything that's taught, but it isn't taught explicitly, and it's again true, I've seen it over and over in media and journalism. 3 words, and I don't even think you should explain them right away. Just repeat them 1,000 times and to yourself and to students. And sourcing is everything in terms of information, knowledge. It's not literally everything, but it's a hell of a lot. I mean, it gets you so much of the way to where you need to be on almost any subject, almost any person. Sourcing is everything. And it's not just the name of the source, but then what does that person do? What is their expertise? Where does that person get their money? The money is also part of the sourcing. Who's doing the funding? And that's how if you have that as your mental template of what understanding anything starts with, sourcing is everything.
Yeah, no, exactly. You know, assessing, does this person have an axe to grind? Might this person have a vested interest, or this organization? I think that's critical. I was reminded by our host that a lot of the younger folks won't know who Carl Sagan was. But the closest thing in sort of the millennial generation to Carl Sagan, where a lot of folks got their, learned about science, is my good friend Bill Nye. He's sort of the closest thing, he and Neil deGrasse Tyson are sort of the 2 closest things we have to Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan was a 1 in a million, and we'll probably never see another Carl Sagan. He was a brilliant scientist and just an amazing communicator. And if you haven't seen him, go online, go on YouTube, watch the original. Neil deGrasse Tyson's remake of Cosmos was wonderful, but Neil has a different approach. Watch the original Cosmos series. It's really worth doing. It's remarkable, just for its prescience and just for the phenomenon that was, Carl Sagan.
All right, can we go up there? A few more questions.
Hi, yes, thanks. My name's Quentin Prideaux. I'm doing a Masters in Sustainability at the Extension School. I'm a huge fan of both of your works. I'm having a bit of a fanboy moment at the moment. The fact you're collaborating is so cool. I have an undergrad in physics, I have an MBA, and I trained with Al Gore to give his slideshow, intimate experience, me and Al Gore and just 999 other people. But I gave the talk for a while until I sat through a colleague doing theirs so I could help critique. And after 85 slides, I mean, literally 85 slides of disasters at the beginning, I was thinking, I hate you. You're making me feel guilty and depressed, and I'd rather be doing almost anything else than living through this. And it started making me think, Dr. Hansen said it, Bill McKibben said it, I explained it, and then I thought everyone would then go change their behavior. And, we know that doesn't happen. So it's about the behavior and the motivation side of it. And so I completely changed my talks. I don't use any of the original slides. Started a company that we focus on making sustainability for college students fun, interactive, engaging. It seems like the big missing piece to me, and you've touched on it in various ways. I'm just interested in your thought about, the facts versus the motivation.
Yeah.
And also, this would be the time where you say something positive or optimistic before we leave. And maybe in the energy world, there are a lot of things that don't have the word climate in them. So.
Sure. No, and by the way, I just realized, so Carl Sagan actually got his start at Harvard. He didn't get tenure here, and then went on to Cornell. So there's a historical, but he was here at one point. Sort of revisiting some of the things that we were talking about before, it is really important to not just present this image of doom and gloom, because that leads to defeatism. That can lead to defeatism. It can lead to people becoming disengaged. And so there is this delicate this balance of demonstrating and communicating the urgency of action. How critical it is that we act now without falsely, because it's false, it isn't true, implying that we are committed to catastrophe no matter what we do. So I think that's critical. Communicating urgency, because people do have to be spurred to action, but not communicating a false narrative of doom and gloom. And demonstrating that climate change isn't just about penguins and polar bears. It's not just about animals that we sometimes see in the zoo that live way off in places we've never been before. It's about the way that it's impacting us today in real time. And we don't need much imagination anymore. What we've witnessed over the last year in droughts and floods and superstorms, we don't have to use that much imagination. The impacts are playing out in real time. And now, finally, so the urgency, we're feeling dangerous climate change now, but the good news is that there is still time to solve this problem, and we're already on the trajectory, getting onto the path that we need to be on. And we've talked about some of the, great things that are happening just with the rapid growth of renewable energy and the fact that we're seeing the decarbonization of our economy. Emissions for the first time in decades flatlined a few years ago. So for several years in a row, emissions weren't increasing anymore, demonstrating that we were starting to see this decoupling of our economy from the production of carbon. 2017 numbers went up a little bit. So we're worried that we did see an uptick, but we're starting to see that curve bend down. The problem is we've got to bend it down even faster than would happen in the absence of accelerating that transition. And how do we accelerate this transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy? By putting a price on carbon. And some of the most articulate proponents in the economics community for doing that are right here at Harvard, by the way.
And quick answers, because we've got like 4 minutes and we have 2 more questions.
Okay, this will be very quick. I think we are on the cusp. One of the problems is the era we're living in. Gordon Gekko said it best, greed is good. We are currently locked in a mental paradigm that brings everything down to a commercial transaction. This has choked out the space for a socially, culturally inspiring message that doesn't reside in that space. And we have been living there so long now, you start to feel like it will always be this way, and it will always be somewhat this way, but history provides moments where you break out of that, and a cultural ideal becomes its own reward and justification. I think we're about to cross into that era again, where you can make an inspiring message that is not commerce-based. And I think that who knows what the future will hold, but let's put it this way, the future doesn't stay the same. We are due for that space to reopen, and the idea that human beings have aspirations can draw excitement, enthusiasm, and meaning in their lives out of doing something that is not commerce-based fundamentally. Just it's the exercise of being a great human being and being alive in the right way. I think that space is going to open up again.
I guess lightning round now, maybe?
All right, we've got one question here, and we had colleagues standing back there. So we're turning to the media.
Okay, yeah, staying with that question, we in the media did screw up early on. Well, the editors did, not reporters.
Identify yourself.
Oh, Elizabeth Arnold, I'm at the Shorenstein Center, reporter. We did screw up early on, trying to present this balance. I think it's the editors, but anyway, and contributed to some of the uncertainty and malaise. To what extent do you think the media is doing that now in terms of the gloom and doom story and contributing again to that whole sense?
That's too big a question to answer in a few words. The media is getting the science more and more right, but I don't think the media is currently positioned to get us over the goal line on this subject. It's better than it was, not anywhere near as good as it should be, and how to make that change is a very long discussion.
And I think you're right that to the extent that there's blame here, a lot of it does go to the editorial division, and even we see that even today in the prestige press, in the Washington Post, I'm afraid, as well as the New York Times, you still see op-eds by climate change contrarians. And why do we need to pollute the op-eds of our leading newspapers with anti-science and untruth? And yet, too many editors still see the need to observe this sort of false objectivity of balance, as I call it.
Okay, last question.
Really quick, yeah, Phil McKenna, I'm a reporter with Inside Climate News. 1 year into the Trump administration, if you had to pick the one worst policy or agency's actions, what would it be? And then the flip side of that, what has most surprised you that hasn't come under attack, hasn't been rolled back, or agency?
They might
that's
not
doing
want to reveal that, but
It's a great question. I think it's unfair to ask us, to cite the worst Trump policy on climate change, because there's just so many excellent candidates.
on climate.
On climate change. There's just so many excellent candidates. Withdrawal from the Paris Accord, or the threat to do that, pulling out of the Clean Power Plan, putting a 30% tariff on solar panels, dismantling all the environmental protections of the last 5 or 6 presidential, putting Scott Pruitt, the right-hand man of the Koch brothers, putting the veritable fox in charge of the hen house. In fact, the fox and all of his fox friends, and and they've literally taken over the hen house, and they're renting out rooms to other foxes now, is sort of the best analogy for what we're seeing in the EPA and every other department of our government. So it's hard to choose. What we see is a very well-coordinated attack on climate action and environmental protection in general. What are the good, if there's a surprise, if there's something good, it's been the degree of resistance that we're seeing to those policies, and the fact that people do appear to be rising up and saying enough is enough. That's the good news in my view.
I would say Pruitt, because he has been, I mean, the ideology is not a surprise, but he's been energetic, imaginative, pretty effectively ruthless in his, as a Trumpist. He's been actually quite adept at getting some things done quickly, and that would be my choice.
Yeah, and at least he can remember the name of the department that he's trying to destroy, unlike other.
We're going to have to stop there. We're a little bit over. I hope everyone will join me in a round of applause for both Michael Mann and Tom Toles. Thank you.